So this seminar is part of our seminar series. So we have a seminar about once a month, I guess, where it's an opportunity for our Treescapes teams to share some of their early emerging results from their projects with stakeholders and those that are interested in the programme. So we generally have a really good turnout at these events and people really do enjoy them. So hopefully this one will be no different. I'm sure it will be fantastic. And we're delighted to welcome our Voices of the Future project to talk to us today about their project. We've got four of the team here. So we've got Kate Pahl, Simon Carr, Peter Kraftl, and Caitlin Nunn, who I believe will be joining us shortly. And they're going to do a joint presentation today called Whose Voices Count and Why. And they're going to be talking about how listening to children can solve the climate crisis. So really interesting topic for the seminar today. Before we kick off and I hand over to the Voices of the Future team, just a few housekeeping rules for the seminar today. Abby will put them in the chat. But just if I could ask you, if you don't mind to keep your cameras on, it really is nice for those who are presenting to see your faces and to see your engagement with the webinar. So if that's possible for you to turn your cameras on, please do. Please do keep your mics off unless you are speaking and want to ask a question. And we're really keen for this to be as interactive as possible. So if you want to ask a question throughout the seminar, please raise your hand and you'll be invited to ask a question. So you can either use it with the online hand raising or just wave and hopefully someone will see you, or alternatively do put a comment or a question in the chat function. As you will have seen, we are recording the session today and this is going to be made available on the website afterwards, so those who haven't been able to attend will be able to catch up later. So just bear that in mind that it will be recorded. So I think that's all I need to say. So I'm really delighted to hand over. I think it's Kate, you're kicking off for the Voices of the Future team. I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, welcome everybody, and thank you for coming to this seminar, and we hope you find it useful. There's going to be 4 speakers. I will start off, followed by Simon, followed by Peter, and followed by Caitlin. The interesting thing just to say about this presentation is that yesterday I was in a school in Bolton, and I've only just got the permissions to show this, the images I'm going to show, and that shows how we're so in the middle of our project. We're in a kind of full-on tree planting, working with children mode, and working with children is really interesting because it involves lots and lots of thinking about ethics and permissions and the how of research. And also tree planting is very interesting because it has to be done by the 31st of March. So our space is very busy. I'm going to start sharing my screen. If things aren't clear, do put your hand up. It's really great to see members of the project team here as well, and thank you for coming. And we hope you just enjoy this, because I always think it's fun listening to things. So I'm sharing my screen. You should start to see it in a minute. Share. So you should, can everybody see the screen? Can people, yeah, you're nodding. So our project is called Voices of the Future, collaborating with children and young people to reimagine treescapes. And one of the challenges on our project is this concept of listening to children, which sounds incredibly straightforward and is incredibly complex. And I think this presentation will explore that. Our project argues that young people who are themselves the people who inherit the landscape that we've given them have important things to tell us about what they think about the natural environment. And within that, the concept of treescapes, which is a very broad concept that includes urban trees and trees more generally. And it helps us, that term, because it helps us think about trees everywhere. One of the things we're finding as we go into schools is that the science of carbon capture and the ways in which trees are involved in that is not actually a mainstream part of the science curriculum. And we're really interested in the way in which children and young people's lived experience connects with nature, particularly in urban areas where they might not have so much access to woodlands. And it's really interesting. I was in a school last Thursday with a group of year 8s And I was talking to them about this, and one of the young people said, we've got 8 years, haven't we? We've got 8 years to try and solve the climate crisis. So there's something very urgent about our project, which is actually quite terrifying. I mean, Simon's going to talk about this. So trees play a really important role in carbon capture. But that knowledge is not particularly visible. Even I didn't know about it when I started this project. We need to understand more clearly the mechanisms that mitigate against climate change and how to change our behaviour. And the UK Treescapes programme was funded because of this. And children and young people need to understand. It's very hard to understand why trees are important if you don't grow up amongst trees as a natural thing. And I think one of the things we're realising is that infrastructure needs to be strengthened. So our project is different. We think children know a lot already, which is indeed the case. Children globally know a lot already, actually. And one of the things we're realizing is our project is a global one about trees. They also interact with the lived experience, and we're interested in that experiential and lived experience of what it is to run in a wood. I was watching children run in a wood yesterday, and I thought, this is really interesting. We like to integrate disciplines, which is incredibly hard. Scientific knowledge has a very particular way of thinking about the world, and it's great. We need it really badly. But our thinking about childhood is also important, but perhaps a bit more opaque. What it is to be a child, what it is to respect a child, what it is to listen to a child. We consider in our project ways in which children and young people can become custodians of their own futures through education. And myself and Samir and Johan on the project are thinking a lot about futures and asking young people to imagine their futures. And that's quite a hard thing to think about as well. We're working with the DFE now, and we're hoping to broaden how schools can be supported to change their curriculum and rewild their spaces. There's the National Nature Park Initiative the DFE have, which we're now getting involved in. We're very interested in young people who've got limited access to treescapes and yet actually have a huge part to play in the climate emergency. So now I want you to go into child mode. One of the things that I was trained in, and lots of people in my project were trained in, is this idea of new sociology of childhood from Alison James and Alan Prout. This has a very different understanding of children. Rather than see children as being people who need to be told what to do, which is basically quite often school conceptual framings, you need to get children to do X, Y, and Z. That way of thinking starts from where the child is and understands children as active agents in the world. And a lot of my training at the Sheffield Centre for Study of Childhood and Youth thought about children in terms of permissions and rights, that children need to actually have their rights need to be respected, and also them as researchers need to be respected. And I work a lot with the idea of children as researchers and their understandings and their methods constructing the world that we learn from. So this involves this idea of active listening and this idea of hearing children out. And I was talking about this article on a seminar on Friday, and Mersey Forrest, who we're working with, said, can I have that article? Because it's a lovely article about the need to actually carry on listening, carry on that space of listening. And you'll see on the right a picture of young people putting worms back into the soil. That picture is the tip of an iceberg of a massive amount of activity, which I'm going to show you around worms. And I have got permission to show it. But one of the things about research is we construct research in particular ways. Talking to young people yesterday with Caitlin, we were asked them to think about qualitative and quantitative and co-productive methods. But research can be many things. It can be exploring the nature of the soil. It can be feeling the soil. It can be running. Research actually from a child's perspective can be congruent with their lived experience, but also drawing on that lived experience to make meaning together. So the concept of methods, I think, is really important for us. And I'm really taken with this book, which I've got on my desk, called Slow Knowledge and the Unhurried Child, with this idea of witness and having an attentiveness to children's slow knowledge that's built up over time and accumulated through engagement with materials. And that takes ages. It's very difficult to do a project quickly with children, I think. Most of my projects have been lucky enough to get 3 years funding, and I think that's about right, to move with children through year 3, 4, 5, and 6, which is what we did on a previous project called Feeling Odd in the World of Education, and learn with them rather than just parachuting in and taking materials from them. And Peter Kraftl's book was a book that I found so useful when I started the project, his book After Childhood, with this idea of collaboration as a method, forms of humble, creative, speculative, generous, but nevertheless robust collaboration in which the conventional social, scientific and phenomenological commitments of childhood studies have an important part to play. That mixing together is what we're doing in our project. It's really hard, but it's that collaborative space we're creating that's so important. So here is a piece of research by a child, and I sat with her yesterday and we went right through this, and she has agreed for me to use it. So the child was given a notebook, which Sammy and I said, can you write some field notes about tree planting? We planted, I think, 300 trees. In the end, we planted 900 trees that day. It was a very cold day. And the child drew a leaf, which you can see on the left, that she then found a lot of worms, and the worms were put onto the leaves. And actually, I can't see the right hand, but the worms then occupied the space of the notebook as a really key part of the note-taking. The worms were then taken off and put back into the soil, but the trace of the worms was left on the notebook. Now, field notes are something that we all do as researchers, certainly in the social sciences and certainly in social anthropology, which is the discipline I was trained in and some of the people on my project were. Field notes are notes about what happened. They're traces of the experience. For me, that counts as a field note, that piece of work that the child has done. And actually, it's a really interesting field note about the relationship between the earth, the soil, and the child's observational strategies. So I'm coming to the end of my little section now, but I think one of the things we're puzzling about is the notion of what voice is. This is a drawing that was done as a plan for a piece of tree planting in a school in Old Trafford in central Manchester. And you can see the young people have drawn some trees with a spider and a bug and a caterpillar. And the vibrancy of that drawing, I was there when I watched the drawing happen, is very evident, but also the kind of complexity of the vision of the children. And one of the things we're thinking about is how children's oral and visual stories are entangled with their encounters with significant human and more than human others across multiple contexts. And Peter will talk about how voice is entangled within the trees, within the landscape, within the sites and spaces of the work. So one of the complexities is, where is child? Because when you work with children planting trees, they run, they create these spaces that we are invited into. But it's actually a dynamic practice, child. Child is a dynamic practice. And I'm really taken with Peter Kraftl's idea of child as in the world, as a relational type of phenomena. And I think one of the things we're trying to work out is, how do we listen to those children and how do we make sense of what they say with that construct? So when we think about children's voice, I think we're thinking about something that isn't just language. It isn't just sitting with a group of children doing a focus group. In fact, I very rarely do focus groups or interviews or questionnaires. Instead, it's a kind of complexity, which could be a drawing, it could be a discussion, it could be simply being with children in a forest running. And that relational, material and relational way in which children express their experiences, opinions, desires and preferences, this is from the work of Michael Gallagher, one of my colleagues, is incredibly important. It's almost like we have to get out of the way as adults and create a space where children's voices in their complexities can be heard. One of the things Samia, Johan and I and Peter have been doing in the school in Bolton is to think about where hope is. And one of the things about hope is that it's really hard. When you ask children, what do you hope for? They just look blank. Some of them say something specific, but actually it's a very, very difficult question. And one of the things we've learned is that hope is located. It's figured through the matters, routines and practices of everyday lives. And this comes from another article by Peter. And one of the things that the trees do, the tree planting does, because we do a lot of tree planting at the moment, is create some hopes that are specific around trees. I hope when we plant the trees, they'll be there for a long time. But that longevity is also problematic. Children are completely flummoxed when you say, when is a tree grown up? We've had answers from 1,000 to 30. 30 we say is about right, and then they think of themselves at 38, and that's just unfeasible. So how do you create hope within the practice of tree planting and working with children? And I think it's within the everyday, but it's within that action of planting a tree partly, but it's also in a wider sort of set of actions. I remember somebody saying in a recent seminar, it's not just about the tree planting. So it's a complexity that we're dealing with in thinking through hope. I think it's time for Simon to talk more hopefully. Can I hand over to you, Simon?
Of course you can, Kate. Thank you very much for that. Hello, my name's Simon Carr. I'm one of the co-leads on the Voices of the Future project, and I'm leading a work package which is focusing on essentially making the linkages between evolving carbon footprints of children and young people, mainly in the urban settings, particularly in Manchester at the moment, and thinking about the contribution of urban trees to the sequestration and storage of carbon within those areas. And we refer to this sort of package within the project loosely as what we call tree twinning. And it's good to see Ian Davenport, who's the researcher involved on the project here in the room, but also have Peter Lawrence, also at the University of Cumbria, is working with us. And we also have Emily Lines from Cambridge working on this program within us. So I've put this image up here, which I'm hoping is pretty familiar to most people in the room. This image is becoming iconic of how we, certainly within the science community, how scientists are communicating climate change. If you're familiar with this, this is Ed Hawkins's Show Your Stripes program, which is looking at the temperature anomalies over the course of the 20th and 21st centuries, where we've got the blue lines is where we've got anomalies below kind of the long-term average. The red lines represent years where we're above average. And this has become a really, really commonplace image used within the communication of climate change. It's, for example, it forms the cover of Greta Thunberg's recent climate book that's published late last year. And it's also been used very prominently just in this last week by the IPCC in their publication of the synthesis report for assessment cycle 6. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. And I think, this is a very useful visual way of representing the science of climate, and I've certainly used it a lot in my teaching, and I've used it a lot within the project so far when we're working with children, because it's something that stimulates a conversation. We've used this to introduce that sort of big global picture of why we're undertaking the project in the first place, what the end point of all this is, trying to use it to explore, first of all, how much climate has warmed since the start of the 20th century, before we then go on to exploring why that's the case. Kate, if you could put the next slide up, please. I feel like Chris Whitty doing this. Next slide, please. There we go. So if you could click again, I think it's got an animation. Again, this image is normally the next image that I normally show with children when we're talking about exploring the link between carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with this is something referred to as the Keeling curve, which is the longest record we have of direct monitoring of carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere, first developed by Charles Keeling in the late 50s. But this shows a really important signature of how humans are impacting the Earth system. Particularly, looking at the increasing concentration of carbon dioxide. And what we tend to find is that the children are very, very quick, at all levels. I think I've used these particular images at primary, secondary schools, at different levels within each of those. And the children are really, really quick to sort of recognize the role that carbon dioxide has in climate change. Also, the way that burning of fossil fuels from, much of our kind of society and for energy production, that's responsible for a lot of these increases in concentrations. And then they start making the links with some of their activities, their own particular consumption and behaviors, which, the things that we witness on a day-to-day basis. So, when we're using this particular image with the children, what I've tended to do is sort of really ground it in saying, well, how many clothes are you wearing? How many different garments are you wearing? And beginning to talk about the carbon footprint of each garment they have. Just for interest, a crude approximation, it's about 100 kilograms per garment that you're wearing in terms of its production, transport, the life cycle of keeping it clean, all those sorts of things. So it's a really interesting way of kind of getting the children to think about, actually, how does carbon dioxide, how does climate change scale down to what I do? And it's, there's normally this wow moment when we sort of say, well, a typical carbon footprint in the UK is between maybe 5 and 10 tons per year. And then we scale that to, how does that relate to kind of the weight of the children? Some of the children we were working with last week in Manchester, they'd be approximately 50 kilograms in weight. So they were talking about an annual carbon footprint that was 1 to 200 times their own body mass, and bringing it sort of into this reality of, this is what we mean by, the emissions of carbon dioxide, the generation of carbon dioxide, and what that actually does in terms of representing our lived experiences. And one of the things that really comes out from asking these questions and having these discussions is that children, certainly from key stage 2 onwards, are remarkably knowledgeable about individual elements of what that means for sort of climate futures. They understand those concepts of climate change, greenhouse gases, pollutions, the role of trees, all of these sorts of things. That they understand them individually. But something that we've really started noticing within the project is actually how fragmentary that information is, that the children are picking up information from different subjects. So from, particularly the science subjects, but then talking about climate activism in English and some of the artistic subjects, but not necessarily making those connections, not making that picture of what that global picture is, and I suppose their own agency or otherwise lack of agency for, to know what to do about climate change. And it does place, it feels like it places an enormous responsibility on those children. Kate, if I could have the next slide, if that's possible, please. So this was a diagram that was published last week. This is from the IPCC's assessment report 6, the current report, and it's from their synthesis, and it was the summary for the policymakers, which is the first report that's come out. I'm sure many of you have already seen this recently. And it takes that global show your stripes record, and it does something really interesting with it, because it plots climate futures in the 5 sort of, the range of 5 different climate scenarios that the IPC is sort of working upon. And I think what's particularly interesting in this is that they've placed people on that timeline. They've put 3 generations of people on that timeline, broadly representing, certainly from my perspective, my parents, myself, and children, the children that we are working on within the project. And what that's showing, if you look carefully at the diagram, you can see what those stripes will mean for them at different ages. So we've got the most optimistic scenarios in terms of cutting carbon emissions, capturing and mitigating very heavily, through to almost the business as usual scenarios. And initially, and I don't know what people in the room think, but I looked at this and thought, this is a really powerful tool that again brings that very abstract idea of what climate is going to do over the next 100 years down to our individual lives. But actually, the more I've thought about it, I've looked at that and thought, this is extremely powerful, but it's also a very, very bleak picture. And one of the reasons, I started out in my career as a glacial researcher, a glaciologist, looking at glacier response to climate change. And I've moved away from that because it was actually quite a bleak area of work to be working in. But now thinking about it, everywhere I look in terms of the way that climate science is communicated, it's overwhelmingly communicated in a very negative way. And it makes us question, certainly makes me question whether the imagery such of this is actually helping. Is it helpful? Is it appropriate for working within that sort of wider public theatre, to all ages, adults and children? Because, you look in our media, we look at what's reported in the science literature. We talk about climate crisis, climate emergency, collapse, vulnerability. And these are all very, very powerful terms. But even 15 to 20 years ago, people like Saffron O'Neill and Sophie Nicholson-Cole, more recently, people like Maria Ohala, have been talking about actually the psychological damage that using fear can make. And it generates this inertia. It's almost what on earth can I do about this sense of inefficacy in across the board within society. And that even even with that knowledge in mind, we're still making these very, very fearful messages within science communication that I think creates a very dystopian view of the future. And what's really struck me in the recent sort of activities we've been running within the schools is actually just how much negativity and pessimism there is, even with young children, that children are articulating a very, very hopeless future in many ways. And again, you know, a 12-year-old said to me last week when we were talking about the work that we're doing within this project, why bother doing this research and planting trees? You know, we know it's too late to make a difference. So what's the point of it? And, you know, that's coming from a 12-year-old. That's coming from someone who's starting out in their life. And it was echoed by a number of people. And I know, you know, a number of us that were involved in the activity day that we had last week were sharing similar pictures of actually this quite bleak view of what the future can entail. And often what follows up when we start asking about, well, what should be done? The children jumping straight towards a technological fix, to this idea that we must be able to use technology to draw out this carbon from the atmosphere, and talking about the way that we have to have a technocentric view of dealing with the climate crisis. And that whilst that may be a key part of it, what they're also doing is they're forgetting that actually many of the solutions to this problem aren't technical, but they're actually social and behavioral and cultural in their nature. So if I can have my final slide, Kate, if that's okay. Again, somebody that hopefully everybody in the room that knows. But I think, you know, taking that really quite bleak view, I think what's beginning to emerge from the work that we're doing is actually how the power of poetry, writing, creative and artistic exploration of the links between individuals, communities, the global picture of climate change based on, you know, what we know in terms of science. I think when we start building those connections, we can start engaging and generating these ideas that, yes, climate change is a wicked problem, but actually we can all develop a sense of agency and become and certainly the children can become advocates for positive engagement and hopeful engagement. And, you know, sort of paraphrasing some of the, you know, that quotation from David Attenborough, you know, the first step is enabling the children to make those connections, to make the connections between their everyday lives, the global carbon cycle, the role that trees and other technologies can play in addressing those issues, that we can start maybe, for example, within our project, enabling the student just simply to be able to measure and assess actually what carbon storage are we getting in the trees that they see in their everyday lives. And that nature of that understanding, that experience is critical for developing those hopeful mechanisms about how each child can play their part. You know, if we can start changing that narrative from a dystopian view of, you know, crisis, collapse and emergency towards a narrative of actually saying even little steps, even small steps, every single tree will make a difference over the 30, the 50, the 70, the 90 years of the program. And certainly when we've been talking with the children in all of the primary and the secondary schools and with some of the youth groups that we've been working with, we often ask the question, who cares about trees? And the majority of children at the start of the day are going, well, I've never really noticed them. You know, most of the children have barely given it any thought. And as a consequence, the trees that are in their everyday lives are just, you know, in the back of their mind. They're just not considered. But by the end of every session, many more children are beginning to share with us the sense of actually each and every tree that they see is doing something for them. They're recognizing that the trees in the cities, in the schools, in the gardens, even in the bits of scrub within sort of pieces of derelict land are actually doing some work on their behalf. You know, it's something that we do as the starting measurement of getting the children to understand how to measure carbon in trees. So get them to hug a tree, mainly because, you know, the diameter at breast height is where you measure that first sort of metric to be able to establish how much volume of trees they are. But then what we start doing is we start talking about, well, actually, there are other things. We start exploring the reciprocal benefits that activity that comes to both the humans and the trees, the fact there are physiological, physiochemical responses and actually psychological responses in humans that sort of return trees to actually being not so different from who we are. So what we're doing within that is just getting the children to recognize that those trees are at the front of their mind, that they're doing some really important work to help them. and they're maybe not so different from themselves. That they'll grow, they will have nutrition, there'll be times when they're feeling poorly, there will be times where they'll be feeling strong. And what we begin to do is we begin to kind of decenter the human and start entangling them back with the trees again, start to connect those children back to their trees. And we're now asking the children to identify the trees that they care about. Having done these days within a number of schools, we're now trying to essentially recruit students to start looking at the trees in their everyday lives and to start to communicate back to us what trees actually matter to them, whether it's the trees that they climb, the ones that they see from the garden, the fruit trees that they've been able to get food from, even if it's the trees that they just sit under in the summer. And I think Caitlin will be talking about something related to that in a moment. But as we help them build that knowledge and understanding of the role that each tree plays and start getting them to actually start caring about what we can see, perhaps then that starts enabling that slightly more positive, hopeful engagement with the trees that are around them every day to start valuing what is around them. I think at that point, I've probably talked for long enough, and I'll pass over, I think, to Peter, who I think is taking on the next part of the presentation. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Simon, and good morning, everyone. I'm Peter Kraftl. I'm also one of the co-leads for this project. And one of my roles is to lead on and support a way of kind of looking across the project, which has several work packages and sub-work packages. So is complex and co-produced. And as you might see from the way that we're narrating this morning's talk, kind of spirals through different themes and emerging questions. So what I'd like to talk about is our initial attempts to identify emerging themes and questions across the project. And I've framed this as integration in scare quotes, because one of the points that we're seeking to make is that it's not always possible to capture everything and integrate it into one coherent series of concepts, narratives, or findings. So I'll talk through each of these fairly briefly to give you a bit of a flavour of how these have emerged from conversations across the research team and also, crucially, with children, young people and other stakeholders in our project. Kate, if you could move the slide on, please, that would be great. So the first relates to directly Kate's points about voice and how children, young people choose to articulate themselves and work with us in research. So whether thinking about climate strikes or charts of global temperature change and CO2 emissions, as Simon has showed us, or young people's hopes for individual trees in the future, it's through different kinds of stories that stories connect us both to specific places and to a wider sense of a global reality or realities. So in part, we're interested in how places are enriched by our understanding of other places, as well as by different ways of being in places. So here we've become interested in different kinds of dwelling undertaken by children and young people, skilling, of learning and acquiring different skills with trees, and of responses and practices that really understand the nuances of a specific place, what some practitioners call place responsive practices. So, for example, in our work with very young children, we think about other ways of expressing, other ways of children expressing themselves, of voicing, that are not just about explanation. So could we see children's voices as bodily, through climbing, through rubbing bark, through throwing sticks, but also collective and not just individual, responding to how bits of trees look and feel and to each other within a place? So this isn't just about extracting children's views or asking them to tell stories, but about joining in with a place partway through some of these stories, amplifying them, augmenting them in a way that doesn't always lead to fixed meanings about a place. This also, though, means some really interesting ways that we've explored of thinking about how science comes into these different modes of storying. And Simon has already begun talking about some of those approaches. So, for instance, in one of the schools, we presented children with different images taken of tree roots, of trees that had been growing in different environments, some under stress, some apparently thriving, and got them to think about some of the science behind that. But we then asked the children, using sand and pipe cleaners, to create their own trees and tree roots, and to compact the sand or to sort of loosen the sand to create different scenarios. And from there on, we ask them to think about what might happen to those trees in the future. In other words, to generate stories from that practice. The science might work in different ways. For instance, as our Aberdeen teams have been thinking about in forms of twinning and pairing with higher education institutions to do very specific tasks in schools. So there, for example, they've been using sediment coring kits to undertake pollen analysis and having conversations on from there. Or simply in staging encounters in different ways. For instance, in some of the work we've been doing with young recently arrived migrants, in walking with scientists in a way that goes beyond quite instrumental kind of transfer of knowledge in one way or another. So that fostering of encounters being crucial. Next slide, please, Kate. But also thinking a little beyond voice, we're also interested in action and what this might mean for growing. And here we don't necessarily mean growing up as children age, but growing understood in a slightly broader sense. In part, this is about some of the ways that we've identified how young people take pride in taking action of various kinds, whether that's tree planting, in forms of activism, or elsewhere. So we've worked with a number of environmental groups who either work with young people or have been set up by young people who are engaged in environmental action and activism. And here young people develop their own skills and do more than they thought they were capable of. And as we indicate later, in thinking about how such work and action can be even more inclusive, thinking about how different kinds of young people and different knowledges, skills and stories can be included here. So what we're interested in here is a concept of learning of environmental education and action that is about developmental growth beyond the development of individuals, how knowledge and skills are grown up rather than handed down between generations. So as a more concrete example of that, again in Aberdeen, over the coming years, we hope to follow the experiences of children and young people who've been planting a woodland, their so-called wee forest, and how through everyday practices of weeding, watering, foraging in, playing in, and measuring over a period of years, children learn about trees as living things, even if they weren't the children who planted those trees in the first place. So, for instance, what values will they ascribe to these and other trees now and in the future? How will they live with them? How will they dwell with them? How will they become responsive to that place, as I asked earlier? And next slide, please, Kate. We've also been considering a series of emergent findings around more formal senses of education and the curriculum. And one of our key questions that we're working with is how young people find their curriculum outdoors and in treescapes, how they encounter it rather than simply having it imposed upon them. So, for instance, beyond the iconic moment of planting a tree, looking ahead further, and again, the Aberdeen example that I've just cited is important there, how growing, maintenance and stewardship over time are relevant. The curriculum is emergent rather than simply located around that one very specific and iconic practice. But this might not just be about looking forward. For instance, again in Aberdeen, there's been a lot of discussion about the importance of the understanding of environmental histories and how that could open up new forms of learning about treescapes. As future custodians, it's important that we're aware in a multidisciplinary sense of environmental histories. So again, perhaps we're thinking about storying here, but in a slightly different sense. So, for example, they've been using pollen analysis to explore how previous ecosystems, agricultural and related practices are interwoven with humans and non-humans within environments. So alongside the non-verbal embodied stories of how very young children engage with trees that I mentioned earlier, here are some further novel ways for thinking about ways of talking about treescapes that don't overly privilege and centre humans, just in the way that Simon was indicating earlier. So how might we also extend these areas of into areas of the curriculum not traditionally connected with trees or environmental change? Well, that's something that we've been exploring through our work with English teachers in secondary schools. And one way of doing this has been through conversations with scientists and storytellers to think and write about the symbolic significance of the Manchester poplar as the city's tree, as it's known. So a weaving of stories and histories of place and environment across disciplines. And of course, there's also a range of challenges in all of this in terms of teacher capacity and time and discussion about what different national contexts might enable within and outside of the curriculum. Next slide, please, Kate. Thanks. This then also leads us to a series of questions about what it is in our project to work with these kinds of emergent knowledges with the environmental sector or environmental sectors. And here, I mean, for instance, some of our partners, such as Manchester City of Trees and Mersey Forest, who are working directly in terms of tree planting and landscape management. And certainly with them, we've had ongoing reflection about how together we can challenge and develop what it means to involve children and young people in tree planting. So a key point here is within an emergent curriculum informed by environmental histories, we're not just emphasising restoration or rewilding in particular ways or in uncritical ways, but asking together when, where, how and why should tree planting, rewilding, restoration take place. That kind of asking of critical questions. So then we ask, what might it mean to pick up and work with such emergent knowledges and such critical questioning in education or training for skills and jobs in the environmental sector or in forestry sectors? How might storying and kinds of inclusive practices that we're interested in work through in our various environmental and specifically tree sectors, where there's such interest and already action around those questions? So just come to my final slide, please, Kate. So finally here, we're also interested in opening out broader questions about social and environmental justice, which loop back to notions of voice. And these very much come through our conversations with children and some of these concerns and fears that Simon spoke about earlier. So young people aren't just interested in climate action or learning, but also environmental justice. Linking economic and social issues with climate and nature issues. And we know this from other research elsewhere. So this is about young people's care for each other and for others unseen and far away, as much as it is for the environment. So we've been thinking about the concept of care in relation to professional practice, creative writing and environmental ethics. And here, as Kate mentioned earlier, hope amidst all of these assemblages and fears and complexities plays an important role. We've been really keen to think about time beyond a progress narrative of promise and ruin, where a future where responsibility for future treescapes, perhaps drawing on these interdisciplinary co-produced approaches to storing and voice we've discussed today, might come through. And I'll pass over to Caitlin at this point, who's just going to provide a final example and set of provocations for us in our talk.
Hi everyone. So thanks so much for sticking with us through all of this. I just wanted to bring to a close on behalf of the young people that I'm working with, just to share an example that's come from our work together. And I think just to frame it, working with migrant background children, young people in the project, I think has really pushed us beyond local and national ideas and concerns, and has really encouraged us to engage with other ways of knowing and being with trees and to embrace wider understandings and practices of dialogue, solidarity and action. So an example of this is the Odar tree. This tree, a type of sycamore, was introduced to us by a youth researcher during the process of co-creating a mosaic from photographs taken by youth researchers on a visit to a local park. And the Odar tree comes from Oromo culture in East Africa. Historically, the Odar tree is at the centre of socio-political and religious life for Oromo people. The tree is valued and respected both practically and symbolically. And under the guidance of our youth research team, together we've come to understand the Odar tree as a metaphor for our project, and to think about what it means, what the project means, and what wider engagement with trees means as a site of gathering, dialogue, sharing, and collective action. So if we just move to the last slide, Kate, I guess I get the privilege really of just showing you the incredible list of people who've contributed to today's talk and to the project more generally. And this is really just the tip of the iceberg. We've also got a huge team of children and young people from 2-year-olds to 22-year-olds, and an extraordinary group of organizations that we're working with, from very local to national. So just a big shout out to everyone, and an acknowledgement that what we've shared today is really on behalf of this group. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Caitlin. And yes, a big shout out to particularly Manchester City of Trees and Mersey Forest, who've been amazing. And I think Manchester City of Trees is on the call, and also Natural England and our many partners, because they really have been alongside us and actually created the project with us. It's been a wonderful partnership. So yeah, thank you for saying that. Thank you. Sorry, that was the end. Shall I stop sharing now?
Hi, thanks. Thanks, Kate and Simon, Peter and Caitlin. Really great to hear more about your work. So interesting. I'm Alice, by the way. I'm the programme manager for UK Treescapes. I didn't introduce myself before because I've been having terrible connection problems. So I'm hoping you can all hear me okay. So yeah, lovely. Just wondering if anyone has any questions for the team that you'd like to ask, because now is the time. Jamie Jackson.
That's me. Hello,
Hi.
everyone. Yeah, so thank you very much. It's really fascinating. So it's a question for Peter, really. About have you sort of obviously kind of with the Bi4 project at University of Birmingham, and also Birmingham being a biophilic city, part of the biophilic city network, has it kind of come up onto the kind of biophilic city network hemisphere or mandalas or whatever with this at work, or would you be interested in, because I do a lot of work with Birmingham. I've got a meeting with the climate and with Nick Grayson, the climate and green manager at Birmingham City Council this afternoon, and he's sort of leaving and going to be handing over to a new person. So I just wonder how kind of interested you would be in connecting up with projects in Birmingham that I'm involved in that.
Thanks, Jamie. Yes, we'd be very interested. I didn't mention earlier, I'm actually based at the University of Birmingham, so that would be even easier. Interestingly, none of our case studies is actually in Birmingham. They're mainly in the Northwest and in Scotland, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't make those connections. And one of the things we want to do for our final work package is seek to kind of make connections and what we've called scale up our research to include other kind of locations. So yeah, let's have a chat offline involving Kate, Simon, and Caitlin as well, and see how we could do that. It'd be brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Yu Leng.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Yue Leng, Year 2 Biodesign PhD student, and my topic is just same with this group, same. So I'm wondering whether you have measured after you went, I mean, in the child or your audience daily life, has the audience changed their self-identification of the tree value instead of viewing the tree as human supplementary sources and nutrition? I mean, after you went in their daily life. It's clearly.
So I can maybe start off with an answer on that. I think, yeah, it's probably one of the key things that we need to try and make sure that we're capturing, in the second half of the project, because certainly, what we see, especially with dealing with children in the early years of secondary school, is they're just sort of reaching that stage where kind of that really innocent wonder of the world around them starts being replaced with something a little bit more pragmatic, maybe a little bit more cynical, a little bit more streetwise. And yeah, a lot of the work that we've done within our secondary schools has been very much about many children just going, I've never even thought about it. It's not something I've considered. It's never come across my mind. But what we're now doing with the children is having introduced these ideas. By the end of the day, even the kids that are maybe the least engaged in the activities that we've done, we can pretty much guarantee that as they're walking home or they're going past their street or they're looking at their garden, they're now thinking about that tree in a slightly different way. And what we're hoping for the kind of the next year of the project is that, as we start training and kind of empowering them to be able to measure and look at the trees that are around them, there's a reciprocal thing that we'll gain from them in terms of what are the trees that they're choosing? What are the trees that they're recognizing? So we're setting up things like after school clubs and events that will enable the children to start sort of feeding back to us what matters to them. Because I think a lot of what we're focusing on within the project is trying to change that kind of very one-way transmission of information from adults or from the scientists to the councils to the people that plant trees, to actually turn that around and say, if you're going to protect these things, if you're going to be the stewards of these woodlands and trees in the future, what do you want them to actually to offer you? I don't know whether anybody else on the team has got a further response to that.
Okay, does that answer your question?
Yeah, and also I have another question. Like we say the tree, but the tree, they have outdoor tree and indoor tree. Have you ever been thinking about, even now you focus on the outdoor tree, how to draw the audience go to the indoor tree? Because some people will separate both. I'm just curious, about this one.
Ooh.
Shall I answer that? Just because I think that's a really interesting question. It was about indoor trees and the relationship between outdoor and indoor trees, is that right?
Yeah, because my topic is also on indoor tree.
Yeah. So when we ask the children what they know about trees, that's something we spend quite a lot of our time doing. And Samia, who's probably on the call, and I and various other people have done what we call a listening exercise. They do talk about different kinds of trees. With last week, it was mango trees on a balcony in Pakistan. Trees and tree care is actually quite under-researched in terms of what children think about it. And I can't recall a particular example of them talking about indoor trees, but I certainly think it's partly to do with the affordances. A lot of the children we work with live in fairly confined flat stroke houses in the inner city, and an indoor tree might be difficult to squeeze into apartments. I think that is part of it, is where the children are situated and how few children, some of them do talk about allotments, some of them have back gardens, but that notion of the indoor tree as something that is in a house in the socioeconomic context of many of the children we work with, I'm not sure how much space they'll have. One of them talked about having boxes from China in the backyard of his house. So one of the things that I come across a lot, and this happened in Stratford actually, is a kind of real critique of globalization and the cranes going up in Manchester, the dystopian colonizing the Mars ideas. It's quite hard to be a child growing up in this world. I think indoor trees are great, but I just don't see the children. They haven't actually talked about them, interestingly, and I don't know if anybody else on the team has heard people talk about indoor trees. Balconies are what they talk about, balconies and allotments. The demographic of the people we're working with have balconies and allotments and small gardens.
I say the one type of tree that children have talked about a lot in our activities have been fruit trees. That's been probably the one that we've kind of had the most kind of response from. We did a number of exercises where we were asking children to draw a tree, whether it was one that they'd imagined, whether it was one in their everyday lives. And I think I recall one drawing a bonsai tree indoors, but that was a very isolated example, and that was because, I think, as Kate says, because of the limits of space. A lot of the children just simply don't have indoor trees in their lived experience.
Gotcha. Thank you so much.
Great. In the chat, Jamie McEwen says he has a question for the room. Don't know if you want to.
Hello, yeah, it wasn't aimed at anyone directly. A really interesting talk today. A lot of very varied ways you're engaging children and young people in forest research. And my PhD project is looking at particularly how the effect of tree diseases is being altered by climate change. And I wondered if there's been any efforts to engage young people with tree disease research.
If I start the ball rolling on that, no, we haven't really talked much about tree disease actually with the children as yet. Where we have talked about the impact of climate change on trees, we've had a number of discussions about what we mean by, there's often the obsession with making sure that we plant native trees, and a lot of the discussions where children have started, there've been a few isolated instances where children are saying, well, this tree is native now, but would it be native in the future? So, for example, thinking about something like a sycamore tree as being something that's really well adapted to potential climate futures in the UK, but not necessarily classed as a native species. So that's been where the focus that I've heard. And I don't know whether other members of the project team have had any discussions about disease.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's often come up more organically. So, for example, when the group of older migrant background young people were working with Peter Lawrence surveying trees, they were paying attention to what was, to any marks on the trees or leaf coverage, and it was really coming out of the questions from the young people. Why is the bark made this particular thing? Why is there a bump here? Why is the sap leaking out here? And I think it's been, rather than being a focus of discussion, it's been really just following the lines of inquiry that young people have had.
Yeah, I think the only time I've discussed it is when we talked about ash dieback, and that was very brief. And to be honest, again, the children's lexicon, we're working on this idea of lexicon of experience, hasn't quite stretched to I haven't heard them say the words ash dieback, and likewise elm. Somebody did mention an elm in a discussion. I was like, oh, an elm. And that was an elm, and there was a kind of link to a grandparent. Grandparents are often very important when discussing experience of trees. So one of the things is to think about, I think it's a really good question, and it's helped me think about where the children are, but also where they've been, where they get their information from. And again, this is about the curriculum. We don't get that kind of, there's the black poplar work. Yeah, we did a project on the black poplar. Well thought through, Steve. I think it's a really good question. I'll go back and think about it. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that was a great answer. It's good to hear that it comes up organically. I think that's probably the more natural way for broaching something quite as difficult to talk about with children, I imagine, diseases and the complexity of it. It's really interesting. Yeah, thank you very much.
Actually, Jamie,
thank you, Stephen.
It's just reminded me, Jamie, actually, that the thing that really captured everyone's imagination when we were talking to Peter, one of the scientists, and looking at the problems with trees, was that the language really mirrored human language about kind of wounds, about they did a coring from a tree, and they're talking about the tree's heart, and I think that really captured their imaginations and really helped them think and kind of connect with the trees. That some of the language that's used, or vernacular language that's used to articulate some of those things, does actually correlate to the way that we think about our own body being damaged or wounded.
Very much so. Yeah, I would agree. Thank you.
Okay, lovely. I don't know if we can squeeze this in. Maybe you can answer really briefly. Jamie Jackson from New Leaf is just asking whether you talk about the symbiosis of wood wide web in your workshops with young people.
Yes, definitely. So that's, the tree hugging exercise is normally the precursor to do that, to talk about the communication between trees. And it's certainly, as a relatively recent sort of discovery, it's mind blowing when you talk to the students about it, because when you start saying there's a physicochemical response for a tree from contact with other species, contact with the other species living on that tree, associating with the tree, and also the mycorrhizal fungi connecting tree roots together. It's that sense of that's where we start saying that actually the trees are not that much different from us, that they need to communicate, they need to share resources, and certainly with 12-year-olds you can just see them going, wow, that's just mind-blowing. And it's these little wow moments that make such a difference when we're trying to get that sort of increased recognition of the trees that are around them.
Okay, lovely. Thanks so much, Simon. So thanks again to Kate, Simon, Peter and Caitlin and all of the team. It's been great to hear everything, and thanks everyone for coming along. I'm sure if you have any further questions, we can perhaps put you in touch with the team if you want to follow anything up. If you get in touch via the Treescapes email, which is treescapes@glos.ac.uk.